Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and in this video I'm going to talk about what I have read for the second week of Victober. I can't believe that it's already half over. I've been reading some great stuff. I've been reading some stuff that's taking a little bit to appreciate, maybe, but I'm still just so very excited to be part of this event this month. And I am so happy to say I got a bingo! I'm only halfway done Victober and I already got a bingo. So that's very exciting. I'm going to keep going and see if I can get a blackout. The only problem I foresee is this square here that says references Robinson Crusoe. It's so specific and I'm not entirely sure that I'm going to be able to color that one in. If I was reading the Moonstone, no problem at all, but so we'll see. We'll see how close I get to a blackout on my bingo sheet. I've finished a book. I finished The Dead Secret by Wilkie Collins. And this is the third Wilkie Collins that I have read, and I really like Wilkie Collins. He writes the kind of stories that I just go for. His sensation novels, sometimes his novels feel gothic. There's always some kind of mystery involved, and I'm in for all of it. This was for the challenge to read a book that's in your favorite genre. And so this book was published in 1857. It's written in the third person and it's set in Cornwall. And so I really love books that are set in Cornwall, especially books that are like sensation or gothic. There's just something about Cornwall that suits, you know, you've got the moors, you've got the coast, the history of smuggling. I don't know what it is about Cornwall, but it really just seems to suit that style of story. So as far as plot goes, Miss Treverton, I believe is the name. Let me just double check. Yes. Mrs. Treverton is on her deathbed when the book opens. And she is worrying about a secret that she has not been able to tell her husband. She calls in her maid, Sarah Leeson, and asks her maid to write down the secret and give the letter to her husband after she has died. And what's interesting here is that Sarah disagrees with her boss, her employer, and they have this big discussion about it. So right off the top, you're thinking, why does a maid know what this secret is? And why does she feel like she can disagree with her employer about what to do with this information? So right away, that's very intriguing. So she writes it down, and Mrs. Treverton forces her essentially to take an oath, and she says, if you do not keep to this oath, I will come to you after I have died as a ghost. And Sarah Leeson seems to be really frightened about that threat. And so Mrs. Treverton says she gets her to swear that she will not destroy the letter. She gets her to swear that she will not remove the letter from the house. But before she gets her to swear out loud that she will give the letter to Mr. Treverton, she dies. And so now we've got Sarah Leeson with this letter, and she's trying to decide what to do with it. She does not think that Mr. Treverton should be given the secret. He should not know what it is. And so she ends up hiding the letter and then leaving the house immediately and disappearing. Mr. Treverton actually sends out people to look for her, and she disappears. And then 15 years later, the story is taken up where the daughter, Rosamond Treverton, has now grown up and is married and is going to move back to the house. The house has been empty for years. Captain Treverton did not want to live there after his wife died, and so they had moved away. And so Rosamond and her new husband want to move back to the house. And I'm not going to go any further into the plot because I don't want to reveal too much information, because I recommend you should read this book. It was really very entertaining. So let's talk about characters. Mrs. Treverton is only in the first chapter of the book, obviously, because she dies. But you hear about her throughout the book. You learn that she was an actress before she married the captain, and not everybody was happy with her previous employment, let's say. Captain Treverton, her husband, he is obviously a captain, so he's in the Navy, and he would spend time away on his ship, and their daughter Rosamond, who was 5 when Mrs. Treverton died. Rosamond, as a grown-up, is an interesting character. She's, I would say, at times a little, not entitled, that's not the right word, but she likes to get her way, I think, a little bit. And yet I find I don't dislike her. I like her. And mostly just because of how she is with her new husband, and the way she treats her new husband, and actually the way she treats other people too. She likes to get her own way. She knows her place in the world, and yet she is essentially kind. Her husband is blind. They've known each other since they were kids, and he became blind after an accident, so he knows what it is to be a seeing person, and he can remember things, but he is now blind and very dependent on his wife. And then you get a few other great characters. There is the brother of Captain Treverton, Andrew, and his servant Shrowell. What a great name, Shrowell. So Andrew Treverton and Shrowell live in a home, and both of them shun society, are rude and grumpy. Andrew had a couple of experiences in his life that led him to believe that all people are backstabbers and betrayers and bad. And he can't be bothered with society anymore. He had a big blowout with his brother because he called Mrs. Treverton something very, very terrible, and they never actually say what it is in the book, but you can kind of guess, because he was very unimpressed with the fact that she was an actress, and he would not apologize for said comment, and so he was estranged from his brother. So these two are hilarious, and there are some chapters where it's just the two of them interacting in their house, and they're really very, very entertaining. They're horrible people, and I wouldn't want to know them in real life, but those chapters were very entertaining. So I gave this 4 stars. I really enjoyed this story. The secret in the end, when it's revealed, is not a huge surprise, and for the modern day reader, I have to say probably not really that great of a shock. But some of the actions of the characters are interesting and probably not what the modern person would do in this situation, and so that makes it an entertaining story. I would recommend it for sure. I've also continued reading in Detection by Gaslight, 14 Victorian detective stories, and so I want to tell you about a few of them because they were very interesting. First, I want to talk about a short story by Catherine L. Purkis. I've never read anything by her. She lived from 1839 to 1910. She's very much a Victorian writer, and she wrote about a lady detective. I think it is hilarious whenever the word lady is put in front of an occupation. It's just so funny. Lady typist, lady detective, lady doctor, right? It's just hilarious. So, but she wrote about a lady detective in a time when detecting was predominantly a male occupation. And so having a female detective was unusual. And there is a description of the author and what she wrote before the short story, and it says this. So she wrote one book in 1894 called The Experiences of Loveday Brooke, Lady Detective. Brooke works for Ebenezer Dyer's detective agency as, quote, the shrewdest and most clear-headed of our female detectives. She was not tall, she was not short, she was not dark, she was not fair, she was neither handsome nor ugly, end quote. Dyer explains that Brooke, quote again, has the faculty, so rare among women, of carrying out orders to the very letter. She has a clear, shrewd brain, unhampered by any hard and fast theories. She has so much common sense that it amounts to genius, unquote. What little is known about the creator of the first important female detective was unearthed by Michelle Slung for her introduction to the Dover edition of Brooke's Cases, now out of print. Purkis was active in anti-vivisection, she was against autopsies and humanitarian causes. The author of many melodramatic romances, I've read one of them, says the editor, and it has nothing to recommend it. But if she had written nothing more than the Cases of Loveday Brooke, she would still have an honored place in the development of detective fiction. So the short story that I read was called The Ghost of Fountain Lane, and I really enjoyed it. I'm actually on the hunt for more by Catherine L. Purkis. I want to see if I can even find a copy of her book, The Experiences of Loveday Brooke, Lady Detective. I don't know if that's going to be possible or not, but I'm on the hunt for it. Loveday Brooke is a great character. She's a good detective. She works well with the police, and in The Ghost of Fountain Lane, she's on a case. There's a ghost. The people think that it's a ghost, and so she's looking into what it potentially could be. Meanwhile, the detective who comes to see her wants her information on some bad checks that have been passed. But anyway, it was really good, and I would definitely look for more by Catherine L. Purkis. There was a short story by Rudyard Kipling, which was only okay. I actually haven't read anything by Rudyard Kipling, but according to this description, it says that he was interested in crime and occasionally in investigation. He wrote 5 stories about E. Strickland of the Police, 3 of which have no detection, but one of these, The Mark of the Beast, is a splendid horror story. The Return of Imre, which is the short story I read, was first published in Kipling's collection Life's Handicaps, Stories of Mine Own People in 1891. And so this one was okay. It was The Return of Mr. Imre. It was set in India. Imre disappears, and then someone else is living in his house. I guess the Strickland guy is living in that same house, and so it was only okay. And then I read a short story by Headon Hill. This is another Victorian detective writer that I've never read anything by. He lived from 1857 to 1924, and that's the pseudonym of Francis Edward Granger, one of the forgotten authors, it says, of detective fiction. The most complimentary thing that has been said of him is John Carter's comment that Hill ill deserves his oblivion. Certainly among collectors, his short story volumes remain well known, but only because they are of legendary rarity. The stories about Sebastian Zambra in Hill's first 2 surviving volumes retain some interest, though too often they borrow plot lines from Sherlock Holmes. Of much more significant are the cases in the Divination of Kala Persad. In the first story, Mark Poignant goes to India, and a wizened old detective supplies the clue to solve the mystery. In the later stories, Poignant brings the old man to England with him, where his meditative techniques help resolve crimes. So the divination of the Sagari capsules is one of those stories where he has brought this man back with him. And so he's a detective offering confidential advice. And what he has done is he's set this old man up in a room in the back, but with like a view through one of the paintings on the wall so that he can see and hear what goes on. And so then the guy, you know, when clients come in, they tell him their story, and then he goes back to see what this man has to say about it. And quite often what this man has to say is something that this Mark guy wouldn't have thought of, and that kind of gets him on the trail to the correct solution. It was okay. And then I read a short story by the Baroness Orczy. Now, the Baroness Orczy is famously the author of the Scarlet Pimpernel stories, which I love. Also, she has quite the name. Listen to this. Emma Magdalena Rosalia Maria Josepha Barbara, Baroness Orczy. Right? That's awesome. She was born in Hungary. And at the age of 15, she moved to London. The short story that I read is one of her Old Man in the Corner stories. Orczy's first stories about the Old Man in the Corner were published in the 1901 volume of the Royal Magazine. Besides their constant variety and cleverness, the Old Man in the Corner stories are notable for offering the first example of the armchair detective. True, the old man does occasionally visit the crime scenes and take photographs, and sometimes he attends trials, but mostly he solves the mysteries brought to him by a reporter named Polly Burton while sitting in a small restaurant, drinking milk, eating cheesecake, and tying endless knots in a piece of string. So there you go. In the York mystery, he is in his cafe eating cheesecake, drinking milk, and tying knots in string when Polly comes, and he shows her a photograph and tells her a story in which he solves the case. And it was good. I would definitely read more Old Man in the Corner, and I actually have the third in the series, The Case of Miss Elliot from 1905. I haven't read that collection yet, but I do own it. So I'm enjoying these. I'm enjoying discovering new Victorian detective authors. Some better than others, but it's been an interesting read for sure. I have continued on in my read of Shirley, and I'm still having a bit of a problem with this. It's getting better. I am getting more into it, but I'm still having like a bit of a struggle with what the plot is supposed to be in this book. I'm fairly certain that Carolyn is supposed to be the central character, but again, it's a little bit unclear. I think my biggest problem is that I haven't been able to suss out what the central conflict is yet. Is it the events going on at the mills, right? The owners that are trying to run a mill profitably with nowhere to sell their product, and having to like cut down on staff, and then you've got these poor people who are out of work and that are like causing trouble at the mills. Is that the central storyline, or is Caroline and her love of Robert Moore the central conflict because he doesn't appear to love her back? I'm not entirely sure. I'm also struggling with the pacing of the story. I'm finding it a tad uneven. There's times when it's slow, and that's okay. Sometimes the plot's supposed to be slow. And then there's diversions, and then suddenly it'll pick right up. So I'm finding the pacing really uneven. Chapter 18, however, has the best title ever. Let me find it here for you. Are you ready for this? Which the genteel reader is recommended to skip, low persons being here introduced. Best chapter title ever. What kind of author tells their reader to skip a chapter? Very, very funny. At the end of chapter 10, I marked a passage that I liked. It's about Carolyn and her relationship to Robert Moore. These efforts, her efforts of exercise and distraction, essentially. These efforts brought her neither health of body nor continued peace of mind. With them all she wasted, grew more joyless and more wan. With them all her memory kept harping on the name of Robert Moore. An elegy over the past still rung constantly in her ear. A funereal inward cry haunted and harassed her. The heaviness of a broken spirit and of pining and palsying faculties settled low on her buoyant youth. Winter seemed conquering her spring. The mine's soil and its treasures were freezing gradually to barren stagnation. I think this is why I'm continuing with the book, is I am interested enough in what happens to the characters, hopefully something happens, to keep going. But then you also get these moments of just this beautiful writing from Charlotte Bronte. Here's another example. This is from chapter 19. And it's following, it's when a mob basically descends on the mill and are attacking it. You never heard that sound, perhaps, reader. So much the better for your ears, perhaps for your heart, since, if it rends the air in hate to yourself, or to the men or principles you approve, the interests to which you wish well, wrath wakens to the cry of hate. The lion shakes his mane and rises to the howl of the hyena. Caste stands up, ireful against caste, and the indignant, wronged spirit of the middle rank bears down in zeal and scorn on the famished and furious mass of the operative class. It is difficult to be tolerant, difficult to be just in such moments. So I am continuing on with Shirley. I have also started Queen Victoria by Lucy Worsley, 24 Days That Changed Her Life. I've read 2 chapters so far. Chapter 1 is the wedding day of her parents. Chapter 2 is the day of her birth. I really like the way that Lucy Worsley writes. It's a very readable, very engaging, but still with a good amount of history and interesting little tidbits, I think. One thing I didn't realize, I know that the royal families in Europe are all intermarried. They all marry each other. And so you're going to end up having like distant cousins marrying each other. But Victoria and Albert were first cousins, and I did not know that. And yeah, anyway, I'm really enjoying this, and I'm going to continue on as well. And then I've also been reading, and this is just for fun, it wasn't written in Victorian times, but it's a mystery set in Victorian times called A Knife in the Fog by Bradley Harper. This was published in 2018, and this is a story about Conan Doyle, and he gets asked by the Prime Minister to come and help with the investigations into the Ripper killings. What's interesting about this story so far, I'm only about 50 pages in, is how many true historical people the author chose to put into this story. I find that fascinating. So we've got obviously Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes stories, and at this point he had only written A Study in Scarlet. He also has Dr. Bell, who is Conan Doyle's, he was his professor, and Doyle based Sherlock Holmes and his method of investigation on Joseph Bell. He's in this story. The police officer who famously investigated unsuccessfully the Ripper killings was Aberline. He's in here. And also a woman called Margaret Harkness. and I've never heard of her before. I find it fascinating that he's including her in this story, and I would really like to get a hold of some of her work. So she was an author at the time, and there's an interesting note about her here. Let's see. So the author's note at the beginning is interesting all around. I'm just going to read it. The period of the Ripper murders in 1888 was an interesting one for Arthur Conan Doyle, both as a writer and a physician. He had a successful practice as a general practitioner in Portsmouth and some small pieces of historical fiction accepted by minor publications, but nothing that had attracted much notice. His first Holmes work, A Study in Scarlet, completed in April of 1886, was his largest and most ambitious work to date. He sent it to various publishers and was hurt by what he described as the circular tour of his manuscript. Fortunately, Jeanie Bettany, wife of the editor-in-chief for Beeton's Christmas Annual, plucked it from the slush pile in her husband's office and convinced him to buy it. They offered Doyle £25, which he found insulting, as they also demanded full copyright, but he ultimately agreed. For the remainder of his life, Doyle never failed to mention that those £25 were all he ever received for his introduction to the world of his most endearing character. In July of 1887, he began a historical novel entitled Micah Clarke about the English Civil War. When Scarlet came out in the Christmas Annual, it was an instant success, selling out within 2 weeks after a positive review from the Times. Doyle, embittered by his meager pay for the story, labored on finalizing Clarke, which occupied him for the next year. The second Holmes novel, The Sign of Four, was not published until February 1890, roughly 15 months after the Ripper's last victim, and nearly 4 years since Scarlet. The Ripper murders therefore took place in the interim between Scarlet and Sign. All the Ripper murders occurred in 1888, but there is still debate as to which woman slain that year could be attributed to him. There are 5 all experts agree on, however, beginning on the 31st of August 1888, and the final canonical victim on the 9th of November. These 5 murders over 70 days within the narrow confines of London's East End were so brutal that they made Jack the Ripper into an immortal figure of savagery and fear. And then at the back here, he has a note about, here she is, Margaret Harkness. There's a picture here. This image is the only likeness of her known to exist. In the summer of 1888, Margaret helped organize the Match Girls' strike to better the working conditions for the women who worked in the factories. Sadly, these efforts were unsuccessful, but in 1889 she persuaded Cardinal Manning, the Bishop of London, to intercede in the London dock strike. This resulted in the formation of trade unions for unskilled laborers and vastly improving working conditions for approximately 100,000 workers. So she has a book called A City Girl that I'm currently on the hunt for, because I would like to read the book and learn more about her, because she's a Victorian author that I've never heard of. So that's A Knife in the Fog. And then lastly, I started reading Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is the last book that she wrote, and unfortunately she died before she wrote the final installment to this, so it is unfinished even though it is massive. This was serialized in Cornhill magazine between August 1864 and January 1866. So people were, if they wanted to read this story, that was 2 years of their time to read this story. I don't know that I would want to take 2 years to read any story, never mind Wives and Daughters, because I'm really enjoying it and I'm glad that I have it all at once and I can read it at my own schedule. It was published in volume form in 1866. I really like Elizabeth Gaskell. I like her style of writing. I find it very easy to read. This book, although I'm only about 50 pages in, I'm already finding is pretty funny at times, and it's got really good pacing, which means I don't think that it's going to take me very long to get through this. So this is the story of Molly Gibson. Her father is the doctor in their village. And so yeah, it's just been really nice. And there's a couple of things that I noted that I wanted to share with you. One is on page 34, we're introduced to Molly's governess, who is called Miss Eyre. So it just made me wonder, Jane Eyre was published in 1847, so I wondered if this was maybe a nod to Charlotte Bronte. Charlotte Bronte was already dead. I believe she died in 1857, but I wondered if that was maybe a bit of a nod to her. I thought that was interesting. And then at the end of chapter 3, there's this sentence: "But after all, these were the small grievances of a very happy childhood." So not much time is spent with Molly as a young child. The majority of the story takes place starting when I think she's 17. But it's I just thought it was good to note, you know, that she briefly told about her childhood and that it was a very happy childhood. And that all childhoods, even very happy ones, have their small grievances. I just liked that phrase, the small grievances of a very happy childhood. So I will let you know as I continue with this story what I think, but I have high hopes for this one. I am already very interested. She writes really good characters. And so yeah, I will let you know as I continue with this. So that is what I've been reading for Victober. What do you think? Have you read any of these books? I would love to chat with you in the comment section down below, and I will see you for another video soon. Bye.